Bueno, pues habrá que tomar nota de todo lo que nos ha dicho Mario Picazo para el bien de todos. Y es que el calentamiento global del planeta y el COVID han puesto de manifiesto y nos han mostrado la imperiosa necesidad de cultivar sinergias, de fomentar la cooperación entre países para cumplir con los objetivos del desarrollo sostenible que plantea la Agenda 2030, con la que el BNU está comprometida. Y ya sabemos que para tomar decisiones en común hay que estar abiertos. Volvemos a Economic Zones, el canal de BNU, para presentaros ahora el panel BOPEN. Se titula Reforma estructural de la Organización Mundial del Comercio para consolidar el multilateralismo post-COVID-19. Tenemos de nuevo con nosotros a la directora ejecutiva de la Asociación de Zonas Francas de las Américas. Ella es Camila Moreno, desde Colombia. Hola, Camila. Bienvenida de nuevo.
Muy buenos días.
Buenos días. Y ella moderará este diálogo digital entre el señor Juan Carlos González, de Colombia también. Hola, Juan Carlos. Hola.
Hola, muy buenos días desde Bogotá. Un saludo a toda la audiencia.
Buenos días. Y también tenemos a Hamid Mamdou, de Egipto. Hola, Hamid.
Hola, buenos días.
Buenos días. Pues adelante, Camila, cuando quieras.
Vale, muchísimas gracias, Ana. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining today. We have two very, very special guests. On one hand, we have Hamid, as he's the senior consul at Kind & Spalding at the Geneva office. And he was the former director of trading services and investment at WTO, and he has 35 years of experience in the multilateral trading system. So thank you very much for joining today, Mr. Hamid. And we have Juan Carlos González. He's the vice president. He was the vice president of foreign investment at ProColombia, former ambassador of Colombia in WTO. And right now, he's the vice president of competitiveness at Bogotá Chamber of Commerce. So good morning, and it's an honor to have you both here today to talk about a very, very important and sensitive topic, which is the future of WTO and the multilateral trading system. So I would like to start with this anecdote, Hamid, so you understand my feeling. As some of you might know, I did the WTI program, which is specialized on the WTO. And I had this constant feeling that the WTO was not moving on, and all the teachers were talking about the crisis. So I was talking to my teachers, why am I doing this master's degree if you're telling me that the WTO is not moving forward? And then when I was in Geneva, Acevedo was appointed as the DG of the WTO. And then there was this sense of hope, and they said he was ambassador for many years, so he's going to make the WTO really work. And then I had faith, but unfortunately, well, we're again in the process of election. So Hamid, tell me about, give me some hope, please, and tell me what went wrong during all these years, and what structural real reforms need to be done, because we're all waiting. We're just waiting. So please let us know what reforms, what really needs to be done at WTO.
Well, thank you, Camilla. This is a question on which you can have a whole workshop.
Exactly.
But I like very much the way you approached the question, which is starting with a diagnostic question. Can we know what went wrong first before we start looking at solutions? And that's a very insightful way of looking at the problem. And if you ask me my views on that, what I've observed over the past 20 years in particular was that there were three phenomena actually that represented challenges to the system. Three important phenomena. One is the leadership deficit. This system was created and was run through very, very visionary and purpose-driven leadership by the United States and Europe. That's how the WTO was created. But since the financial crisis, we've seen that this role of leadership really has sort of faded away. And this is terribly important to drive the agenda of the organization and keep it focused on its sense of purpose. The second phenomenon, which is technology-driven, is this increasing complexity of trade policy issues, which requires the deliberative function of the WTO to be more alert and more up-to-date, because it feeds into the negotiating function as well. And then the third is that the sense of purpose, the sense of common purpose on which the system was built, started fading away. And this actually, we felt it more acutely after the financial crisis, this backlash against trade liberalization, against globalization and all this. Now, these three phenomena have actually led to the clear symptoms that we see in the WTO, which is a chronic imbalance in the vital functions. And the vital functions here, I mean the three functions of dispute settlement, negotiation, and the deliberative function. The system was designed like a tripod with three legs. Now, we had the negotiating function breaking down, and we had the deliberative function subsiding, and then we had a dispute settlement function that kept gaining strength because of the inherent automaticity in the dispute settlement procedures. That was not sustainable, and that's why the third leg, dispute settlement, broke down as well. So what we face today is this breakdown in the vital functions. Now, how do we address this? We need to look at it in a holistic and a comprehensive way. Those three functions are very, very interlinked. You cannot rely on one or two without the three actually complementing each other. That's how the system was designed. Second, we need to go back to the why we're here, the common sense of purpose, which is we need to promote trade for the prosperity and peace of people and countries. And that leads us to what do we want to achieve? And I move from the why to the what. And the what actually is that we need to restore the functions, the three functions of the WTO. And we need to update the rule book because we haven't been negotiating for 20 years. And we need to rebuild our relationship with the private sector and the business community. And we need to strengthen our bridges with other international organizations. We are in a bad situation today where governments have lost touch with the system and how it functions, and business has lost faith in what the WTO could do for them. So if that's what we want to achieve, then we come to the how. And the only way, in my view, to achieve this is to have a purpose-driven and a comprehensive approach to reform efforts, where we look at the three functions and we focus on the negotiating function as the gateway, because if you can't bring people around the table to negotiate, you're not going to get anywhere. There are so many things. Even the reform process itself is a negotiating process. And that's where we need to start. And this is where we need to start having different kinds of conversations, and conversations that would inspire what I would call the enlightened self-interest in governments, where they start looking again at the WTO as the solution and not part of the problem like some capitals do. Now, how do you achieve that? You actually have different kinds of conversations that would have to be based on clear analysis and clear diagnostic view of the situation. And that's why I like the way you started your question. So back to you, Camilla.
Thank you very much. And some of the things I'm going to point out in the next round of questions. But first, I want to go to Juan Carlos. Juan Carlos, you, in your experience, you have a broad experience with the business sector, working at ProColombia, now with the Bogota Chamber of Commerce. But you also were able to be in Geneva, seeing on the first hand how WTO worked. So I have two questions. Hamid already showed us the panorama and some structural reforms that really need to be done. From your perspective and more business-oriented, which reforms are needed and how this WTO crisis is actually affecting the business sector from your point of view?
Thank you so much, Camila, and it is a pleasure to share this panel with Hamid. Um, let me start by maybe reflecting on my experience as I headed to Geneva in 2016, and also my perception of what's happening at the time and then what happened later. When I headed to the WTO, my sense is that things were not moving much, but overall things were okay. And in the sense that, let's say, the system was sort of working, it wasn't advancing, but the WTO wasn't on the news. And I guess people were sort of okay in terms because the dispute settlement system was working. And then starting by the end of 2016, we started to have more pressure on the system, and more changes became maybe possible, or at least the pressure to have changes became a bit more possible. My sense is that, for instance, from the perspective of Colombian business, since we have most of our trade, it is covered by free trade agreements. I didn't have a sense that for business people, the WTO was so much in the radar, because I guess most of the things were dealt with our major partners through bilateral agreements. But I guess you come to a point that that people take for granted things that they think that they should be there forever. And then all of a sudden, when you think that the system might fall down, then you start to realize, well, I cannot take for granted something that it is there. It's like oxygen. It is there, and I don't realize that it's there. But you know, if they take it away from me, then I realize that if they take it away from me, I have a problem. So there is like some when it comes to business, you realize that there is some major fundamental characteristics of the WTO and the system that are very important for business. The first one is the predictability. If you have rules that allow you to know what is going to happen, you are able to trade and you're able to invest. So of course, basic rules such as, you know, the most favored nation or the national treatment, as long as everyone is compliant with that, the architecture of the system is sort of okay. But all of a sudden, if some players or some major players start to decide that that is not going to be the way that is going to work, then you realize that, okay, maybe the rules are not so predictable. And if the rules are not so predictable, then it is difficult to make decisions for business and for investment. I will maybe refer to one experience, but when you have, for instance, the US putting some barriers on imports of steel, you know, that started to change the way the conditions work for business decision makers, because all of a sudden, instead of having a rule that was predictable, then each government had to go and negotiate with the US to see whether their businesses were not going to be affected by that or not. So that becomes sort of more difficult for companies to realize how to work in that environment. And of course, the other one is a very important feature of the WTO is that when somebody does something wrong, you can enforce the rules. And that's why dispute settlement is very important, because at the end, one of the major gains of the WTO system compared to other multilateral systems is that it is not just talk. If you do something wrong, then there is a price that you have to pay. But when the system doesn't work, when something like what is happening with the dispute settlement body happens, and when you don't have the appellate function working, then when members resort to the appeal of any decision, then you don't have the possibility to have a solution to that. So that means that you are in a limbo So again, that brings also uncertainty for businesses. So I guess the problem that we're having right now is that if we weaken the system, then there is not a clear predictability of the rules, and that's a major problem for business decision makers. And then also, if the rules cannot be enforced, then of course the system is going to lose one of those very important three legs that Hamid was mentioning about. The other thing that is important for business, I guess, is that you realize when you are in the WTO that there are very important things that cannot be negotiated bilaterally. There are major and important things that will affect business or that continue to affect business. For instance, in agriculture. Agriculture is a major pending issue in the WTO, negotiating the subsidies that affect global markets. And the only way that we can fix that is through WTO negotiations. And if that is not fixed, of course, there is not the possibility for business people, especially in the agribusiness, to make decisions and to invest. And also, if you take, for instance, right now at the decisions that are taken or the negotiations regarding fishery subsidies, which is the only major important negotiation that is taking place right now. There is a deadline that should be complied by the end of this year, but I think that is not going to happen. Maybe it's going to be next year. But again, this is not just important for the environment, of course, but also if we're not able to negotiate on how to deal with the sustainability of the resources of our fisheries, then there will not be business for the future. So there will not be business for companies. Again, we need a strong WTO for that. And finally, I think that there is issues for which the WTO already have some rules, which if we weaken them, then of course we will have problem. But also there is some other issues that are very important for which the WTO doesn't have still rules. And the fact that we haven't been able to negotiate those rules, that means that there is not also clarity or opportunities for business to actually take advantage of those opportunities. And I'm referring, for instance, to e-commerce. E-commerce, again, is a very important pending issue to be negotiated at the WTO. And especially now, with after the COVID crisis that we're facing, of course, more and more companies are moving towards digitalization, towards the use of e-commerce. And the WTO has been talking about the possibility of negotiating something on e-commerce for more than 20 years. Hamid is an expert on that. Now we have a plurilateral initiative that is advancing, and hopefully will reach some achievement at some point. But again, it's a plurilateral initiative, and still there is some doubts or some questions on how that is going to be put in within the WTO system. So again, not having rules for the oncoming important business opportunities such as e-trade is something that will affect business and will continue to lack to have more certainty on how to negotiate and how to do business.
Thank you very much, Juan Carlos. Well, that was a really pragmatical view, and definitely business right now we all need the predictability of rules and the enforcement of such rules, and more right now in this world that we're living. Before the COVID, we were already having some issues, but now the world has completely turn around. So it's very important, the business perspective and how WTO play such an important role on the multilateral trading system. Hamid, regarding, well, this is a political question. So what do you think that, to what extent the multilateral trade talks with the rupture of the current U.S. administration, well, of course, is breaking trade. And do you think that with Joe Biden being as the president of the U.S., is there hope for these negotiations? And also, you mentioned something about the purpose-driven. So I'm wondering if you're thinking about as a solution that the consensus-based decision-making is still relevant at WTO.
Well, thank you, Camilla. I think we start with what I mentioned earlier, which is to try and inspire the enlightened self-interest. If you look at the situation between the United States and China, I think the one way to approach this would be, first of all, to try and make a distinction between the trade agenda and the broader geopolitical tensions. I wouldn't say separate, because that's not realistic, but just make a distinction that the trade agenda is an area where win-win situations or win-win outcomes can be achieved, as opposed to other political rivalries that has winners and losers in mind. This is an area where everyone can win. So that sort of enlightened self-interest would also lead to the thinking that in any bilateral tensions or in any bilateral interests and bilateral negotiations, bilateral solutions are by definition very transactional and more short-term based. Multilateral solutions, on the other hand, in a situation like that, would be more rule-based, more principled, less transactional, and therefore more long-term and more sustainable. So it must be in the interest of both parties to look at solutions that would reduce the tensions in order to achieve those win-win outcomes. But the political issue here is that this requires different kinds of conversations than those that are taking place now, particularly in the WTO. Now, how can we promote those kinds of conversations? That is the big question. Now, how are we going to move from that sort of area where they're looking at the WTO as, or particularly one of the parties is looking at the WTO as part of the problem, not part of the solution? How do we have that mindset shift where they would start looking at the WTO as the place where negotiated solutions actually can be negotiated? And the point here is, this is a bilateral tension situation. And the reality is that it affects many, many other parties. This is not just bilateral. The tension is direct between the two parties, but it has implications for everyone. And the solutions that they might arrive at will have implications for other members as well. Now, the reality of our situation is that we have a system that has lagged behind in terms of updating the rules. And by updating the rules, I mean there are various areas where the rules need to be updated. Juan Carlos rightly mentioned e-commerce and digital trade. Absolutely. And there are very complex issues there that require trade negotiators to start having different kinds of discussions, which haven't started yet. And to jump from this lack of conversations and lack of discussions immediately into negotiations is not really a very healthy situation. This is why I was referring to the interlinkages between the three functions. But there are other areas as well where suggestions are being made, like subsidies, industrial subsidies and agriculture subsidies. These kind of negotiations would require the right political vision in order to construct the right kind of agenda, packaging trade-offs. And I come here to a very, very critical point, which is also political in my view, and this is the importance of having an agenda that has the right kind of trade-offs, that provides incentives for different members to come around the table and have that kind of collective common interest and common purpose revived again. There are so many issues that require that. Now, part of your question was, what about multilateralism? I think we need to be careful about how we define multilateralism in the context of the WTO, particularly when it comes to negotiations. And I think Juan Carlos was referring to the negotiations on e-commerce as plurilateral. But here we need to also clarify what is meant by plurilaterals. There are plurilateral processes that produce multilateral outcomes, MFN-based outcomes, and there are plurilateral outcomes that only benefit participants, not non-participants. But the plurilateral processes that we have now, like on e-commerce, are aiming at MFN-based outcomes, which will benefit non-participants as well. And that has always been part of multilateralism in the WTO. As a matter of fact, these kind of plurilateral negotiations that produce multilateral outcomes have always been the predominant form of negotiations that we've had in the system for the past 70 years. So why do we have this sort of trend towards delegitimizing those kind of plurilateral exercises that aim at multilateral application at the end? Now, the last part of your question about a Biden administration, I think if we have a Biden administration, we would probably see some differences with respect to more coherence in the trade policy approach, with respect to the way concerns and interests are being expressed, perhaps a more engaging attitude. But let's not forget that there have been problems that the US have been putting on the table even before the Trump administration came to power. And those issues are not going to go away, including, for example, the appellate body and reforming the dispute settlement system, and issues relating to the negotiating function as well, issues relating to the application of special and differential treatment in the system. These are issues that are not going to go away insofar as the US is concerned, simply by virtue of changing administrations. So yes, there would be a difference, but and it may be, more easy to deal and interact and engage with an administration that is less hostile towards the WTO. But this should not lead us to imagining that problems are just going to go away. So back to you, Camilla.
Yeah, thank you, Hamid. And you mentioned something very, very relevant for this conversation, having you both, and is that the negotiations move slowly than business. Business move fast. Business don't wait. Business just keep on. And I remember CEO of Alibaba, Jack Ma, in the ministerial conference in Buenos Aires, he already said, okay, this is the time over for containers, and we're going to start being the parcels in our trading system. Well, and with COVID, of course, this accelerated, and we're having now this tremendous amount of e-commerce that Juan Carlos already mentioned, that you already mentioned. So, Juan Carlos, what from the business perspective and from the policy making, what experience are you having right now in Colombia particularly about the e-commerce and how to move on? And is it possible to wait for the WTO to move for a negotiation regarding e-commerce?
Well, just as an anecdotal experience for you, yesterday I was visiting the center of Bogota, which of course you're familiar with, Camila, and we have in the Chamber of Commerce of Bogota, we manage 17 clusters that aim at increasing the competitiveness and of course the internationalization of these particular clusters. So we were meeting with the jewelry cluster, which is centered around the old town of Bogota, because that's where the tourism to Bogota is centered usually. But of course, there's no tourists right now. And we were meeting with the people and small shop owners that are facing problems because, of course, the business is down. No tourism, no sales. And of course, with COVID, this is even worse because the locals are not buying either. And we were meeting with many of them, and they said, well, before the COVID crisis, e-commerce and digitalization was something that we considered that maybe could happen little by little, but it wasn't a priority. And now with COVID and with the current situation and with no tourism, everyone is moving from the face-to-face business to e-commerce business. And they were saying, well, this has been hard, of course, but you know, in many ways, we are actually having some important results out of this, and it is that we are cutting the middle guy, and now we're selling to the consumer, to the final consumer. So actually, my margins are bigger. And these are, you know, these are micro, small companies that are in this business. So you see from the real side of business that faced with this situation, then people move to new channels, and then digitalization and e-commerce becomes an opportunity. In the case of Colombia, of course, we have a big part of our trade covered by bilateral trade agreements. And if you look at, for instance, the Pacific Alliance, there is some particular issues related to e-commerce that are already in those agreements. But of course, when you want to go into other markets, when you want to explore many other markets, multilateral rules are needed. And of course, there is particular issues within the negotiating area of e-commerce that are important for everyone. For instance, not having tariffs on small parcels, for instance. That is something that would solve the business for everyone. At the same time, we had a multilateral agreement or a multilateral decision on that. So I guess, as you were saying, Camila, business cannot wait for the rules to be made. But of course, having the rules would be much better. When you look at the ministerial conference, the last ministerial conference in 2017 in Buenos Aires, which people said, okay, of course, not much happened there. There was an important decision made by some of the members, and these are again the open plurilateral initiatives that we were referring before to. One of them being e-commerce, another one being on the facilitation and investment for development, a third one on actually particular initiatives to increase the participation in trade of MISMEs, micro, small, and medium-sized companies. And the fourth one, an initiative to enhance and to promote the participation of women in trade. And if you think about that in 2017 and what is happening right now, I think that was a very visionary decision made by some of the members that took these decisions, because those are the key issues now when you think, or some of the key issues that you think when it is when we talk about the future, and in particular when we think of what is happening with COVID, something that we couldn't foresee in 2017 that would happen. And why? Again, because e-commerce is now, it is a pressing need that everyone needs to do. There is some opportunities now linked to e-commerce. Now, companies have become used to doing business by, Teams or by Zoom. So this is now an easier way to do business, and maybe now investors can also advance a lot in their investment decisions without actually having site visits, at least in part of the process. So these are things that are positive for the business decision-making process, but also you need rules that allow this to, in particular, e-commerce rules that allow especially small and medium-sized companies to take advantage of this opportunity. And also, when you think, for instance, about the importance of small and medium-sized companies, when you think about, for instance, Bogota, the reality of the ecosystem of companies in Bogota is that 97% of the companies in Bogota are small and micro and medium-sized companies. And these are companies that are being affected the most by the crisis. When we look at the companies that are not renovating their permit to work as companies because of the crisis, 99% of the companies in the Bogota region are micro and small-sized companies that are facing this situation. So we need, as private sector, as governments, to do something. And trade can be an engine for growth. So, of course, having the WTO pushing for reforms, pushing for opportunities for MISMEs is something that is very important. And again, if you look, for instance, at what is happening with unemployment. Unemployment is hitting everyone very hard everywhere in the world, but in particular is hitting the young, and in particular is hitting young women. So trade can be an opportunity also to increase the employability of women and also to increase opportunities for women. This is linked also to opportunities for small and medium-sized companies. Many of these micro and small-sized companies are headed by women. And of course, a big opportunity to have trade for women-led companies is through e-commerce. So as you see, many of the things that were set up in Buenos Aires that are pending in the agenda of the WTO are the kind of things that I think we need to do and that will impact business opportunities.
Perfect, Juan Carlos. Thank you very much. Yeah, they were very visionary, as you mentioned, talking about trade, women on trade, small and medium enterprises, e-commerce. But we really hope that they bring this to the table and actually negotiate for the small and medium enterprises, because for many years, well, the sense from the business perspective is that at the end, these big rules are made for the big players, for the multinational corporations. So how to work more with the small and medium enterprises? Hamid, I want to ask you, from your background, this is not a WTO question, but it's more from your experience working on trading services. Yesterday, we had a fantastic talk with Pierre Sauvet, that you know, and talking about the services. And well, e-commerce, of course, is a service, but from your huge experience, how trading services is really going to help for the economic recovery?
I think it will play a tremendous role because of the importance of services itself in the economy. You know, services is 70% of global GDP. Not only that, but services also absorb 2/3 of global FDI flows. So the services sector in the global economy is tremendous in terms of its size. But the strategic importance of the services sector as well is in the fact that services are inputs to all production activities. And you cannot have a strong manufacturing or a strong agriculture without a strong services sector. I mean, the example that I always repeat about Egypt, I mean, not many people realize that Egypt is number 6 worldwide in producing fresh vegetables. Now, the question is, how is that tremendous production capacity not reflected in export performance or even in the conditions of the local market? The answer simply is that growing tomatoes on the field is one thing and putting them on the shelf of a supermarket is another. And the link between A and B is a chain of services value transactions. Now, how would the services sector play an important role? I think the importance of services have been given a huge boost by the crisis of COVID-19, as Juan Carlos mentioned. I mean, the acceleration in the digitalization process has been tremendous. What we expected to happen in 5 years happened in 6 months. Now, that has revealed the tremendous potential of digital trade and the role of the digital services part of the economy. But I would add here also at the same time, it also revealed the disparities between countries in terms of digital readiness, and it accentuated the gravity of the digital divide. There are so many countries that have not been able to join that kind of accelerated process. And I'm referring to, of course, LDCs and a number of the poor developing countries. So that brings me full circle back to the question of, okay, what can we do in the WTO and in trade negotiations to expand those opportunities? As Juan Carlos said, business will not wait for rules, but having the right rules and the right negotiated outcomes can hugely expand business opportunities. And there are some complex areas where some trade negotiations need to take place. For example, this interface, this balance that needs to be struck between facilitating cross-border and cross-jurisdictional business electronically and the rising tide of regulation on data governance. How, in many countries, and this also relates to SMEs and MISMEs, if you're not GDPR compliant, you can't do business with European consumers. So how do you facilitate that, and how do you deal with those regulatory barriers which are not meant to be trade restrictive, but the result is they are trade restrictive. So how can we ensure the least trade restrictiveness of regulations? This is going to be a trade challenge that we need to deal with. But the role of services in post-pandemic recovery is going to be tremendous. And if you look at the key sectors, whether it's financial services, including electronic payments, of course, whether it's transport, distribution, logistics, the entire hospitality industry, whether it's tourism, hotels, restaurants, education, healthcare, I mean, the list goes on and on and on and on. Without trade in those services, economic recovery is going to be seriously handicapped. So that we need policymakers also to be aware of that, because I think policymakers have sort of not paid enough attention to services policies as a coherent part of national economies and an important part of trade policy and international trade as well. Back to you, Camilla.
Thank you, Hamid. Yeah, and you mentioned something that I always wondered, and is, well, we always talk about the smiley face and the global value chains and how we always pay attention to this little part of the manufacturing, but the rest of the services which create the great value added was left apart. So I agree with you. Where is this policy makers paying attention to this big value added that we really need, and now with COVID for this economic recovery? And Juan Carlos, I want to ask you, based on what just Hamid said, and talking about this smiley face and global value chains, how are you facing right now, and how are you visualizing these global value chains moving to regional value chains? And is it really going to happen, this nearshoring and reshoring ideas and future that we're visualizing with business regarding these topics?
Thank you, Camila. Well, definitely, I think that's a trend that is happening, and now it is sort of strengthened by the issues that have been happening in the last few years. First, I think that because of the political tensions between the big players such as the US and China, there is, of course, a trend towards having a more diversified base of, let's say, investment, location, sources, and not just China, but it just in general. For instance, Asia vis-a-vis Latin America, something that actually has been accelerated by the disruptions brought about by the COVID crisis, because then it is not just a matter of let's say, political issues, but also a reality of the supply chains, that you cannot have all your eggs in the same basket. So, for instance, if we think about the case of Colombia, Colombia is very well placed to be a location for nearshoring for both services manufacturing vis-a-vis big markets such as the US, because it is not just a matter of the location, of course, the logistics, but also we have a free trade agreement that is very competitive, let's say, the local content and the flexibility of the local content required to have to comply with the rules of origin to be able, for instance, to export to the US are maybe the most flexible ones. We have a very strong platform of free trade zones that allow to provide companies with particular incentives. And we have, let's say, when it comes to fulfilling the requirements of let's say, North American customers, maybe we cannot compete in many areas with the scale of Asian suppliers, but we are more agile to deal with more specific, let's say, demand or request by customers. For instance, if you think about the apparel industry, we cannot compete with large scale production, but we can fulfill very efficiently with higher value and more sort of particular request of customers in the US market. So that means that we can be sort of more like a boutique provider of for US and North American customers. So yes, I think it's a reality because we have the predictability of the rules through the free trade agreements that we have, not just with the US, but with other major players such as the European Union. We have the location and the logistical advantage, and also we have sort of that opportunity to be a reliable source of diversification, in particular when it comes to situations such as the ones that business have faced through the COVID crisis. And in particular, that's the case of Colombia in general. But when you talk about Bogota, it is also a very strong platform for the export of services. One of the key industries growing in Colombia is actually to be able to serve Latin American and North American markets for what is called the business process outsourcing of high-value services. And this is something for which Bogota is a very good location and very well placed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was exactly thinking about the potential of services, especially in the Bogota region, since we're not very close to the ports, and talking about the value added, and Hamid also mentioning all the importance of this services sector. And so from Bogota, I will really recommend, from the nearshoring and reshoring perspective, to pay close attention to the service sector. I'm very sorry to tell you that our time is over. I know WTO issues and trade issues of course will take us the whole day if we would like to stay here. But the main takeaways definitely is that the WTO, besides the crisis, still is very important for the multilateral trading system, for the predictability of rules, for the predictability of enforcement, for business to continue safely doing business and to grow. And also to pay close attention to those issues that you mentioned that were touched in the ministerial conference that are relevant right now. And to finish, I really want to quote Juan Carlos with this COVID situation that you mentioned, like, well, it's like you have the oxygen and you feel that it's for granted, and then they take the oxygen. It's something similar to what is happening right now with COVID. You know it's there, you know that you need to take attention, but you only really like feel until you have it or some of your family members die. And I feel it's something related with the WTO. I mean, you have it there, you know, it's in a crisis, but you don't pay close attention until your business is affected by this. So thank you very, very much for joining today. It was a really honor for me to have you both together, and I really hope to continue this conversation with you.
Thank you so much, Camelia. Thank you so much, Hamid.
Thank you, Juan Carlos.
Thank you very much. These are very good recommendations you both have given for countries to work all together. So I add another thanks for you, Juan Carlos and Mamdou. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you
so
so
much
much.
for having us.
And thanks to you also, Camila. Thank you very much. Es un placer tenerte aquí de nuevo. Gracias por tus preguntas interesantes y por esta intervención tuya preciosa, muy bonita, muy bien. Gracias. Gracias también a todos vosotros, asistentes digitales, también como ellos. Volvemos de aquí unos momentos, después de la publicidad, con el panel Be Safe Zones, aquí en Economic Zones.